We are going to go over some verbal de-escalation. So I just want to welcome you to this training. So you'll see myself, you'll see Courtney, Rebecca, and Jeff, and we are your CPI trainers. We are going to go over some of the parts, and if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us after this training. We're not really sure when you'll be watching it, but it'll be for your convenience. So we are going to move over to Unit 1, and we're going to discuss the CPI Crisis Development Model. This hopefully will look familiar. I believe Courtney is going to go through the first level. So if she presses, yep. So we have anxiety, which is a change in behavior. And when we see that anxiety level, we are going to want staff to be supportive in that empathetic, non-judgmental approach, so that they can respond appropriately to those students. The next level that we see in this model is going to be defensive, and so students are going to begin to lose that rationality. When we see them at this level, staff are going to want to respond in a directive manner, which is decelerating and escalating behavior. Something to note for this, if you have been through our blended version, you might see a note or you might see a difference in language, but it really means just the same thing. The levels still will be the same. If a student continues with this escalation and they move on to that risk behavior, that can be defined as behaviors that may present a risk to self or to others. And so when we're at this level, staff are going to respond by clicking, yep, physical intervention. And they are going to manage that risk behavior, whether it's through disengagement skills, whether it's through holding skills. We're going to document as needed. Once that risk behavior is completed, they will move on to that tension reduction, which is a decrease in physical and emotional energy. And then at that time, staff are going to respond with therapeutic rapport, which is reestablished communication. Something to note with this model is that students might not be classic 1, 2, 3, 4. They could be anxiety, they could jump to risk, they could go down to defensive. They might not even ever get to that risk behavior. Maybe they'll just stay at that anxiety level or that defensive level. And so this is helpful to us so that we know how to respond to that student appropriately rather than underreacting or overreacting. That should be it for that slide. If we move on to the next slide, we are going to discuss nonverbal communication, which is a really important piece to that whole model, that integrated experience between students' response and staff response. With nonverbal communication, we have 3 different pieces to that. We have proxemics, kinesics, and haptics. And so proxemics is personal space. Personal space is very different for every student, depending on their background. If I think about students with trauma or a history of trauma, that personal space might be very different in comparison to maybe a student that has never experienced trauma. I also think about personal space in terms of like older kids versus younger kids. That seems to make a difference as well. And so we're just going to use that and gauge that with our students, especially if they're in an escalated situation. So we're not going to get closer to that student unless we need to. We're going to kind of assess that situation and determine how to use that. Kinesics is our next one, and that is our body language. We're going to use our body language to help de-escalate a situation. And so what I think about, we give the example of hands behind our back or hands in our pockets or crossing our arms. I know that I do that quite a bit just because I coach. And so what does that portray or what does that communicate to students? We might think it's different, but they might perceive it in a different manner, and that might escalate the situation. Haptics is our next one, and that's communication through touch. There are times when communicating by putting a hand on the shoulder is helpful. There are times when communicating by putting a hand on the shoulder is not helpful. And so reading that situation and figuring out how that will help the situation or like hurt the situation. Hurt the situation in terms of escalating it versus de-escalating it. That is it for Unit 2. I think there might be another side if we go forward. Yes. So part of our nonverbal communication, especially in terms of our personal space, is going to be that supportive stance. And so there are 3 main reasons for that supportive stance. And that's going to be communicating respect, being non-threatening, and maintaining safety. If you have been in the, what you'll hear also with this is maybe just being stable and balanced. And so how I find my supportive stance, that might be a little bit different than someone else. And so you'll see that that lady is standing in that supportive stance. And so she has, she's maintaining safety by making sure that she's far enough away from that, the man. She's non-threatening in the sense that she's on the side. It looks more relaxed. And then she's communicating respect, like, I'm not here to harm you. I'm here to listen to you. What do you need? It also is maintaining safety for that lady, as by being on the side, it's protecting those vital organs if in the event that she needs to, if in the event that I guess the man becomes escalated and tries to harm her, then she can make sure that it just is on her side instead of like her front. Things to consider with that with that supportive stance is that position, that posture, and then proximity. And so we kind of referred to this a little bit, but that position is where you are in relation to others, as well as where your exit doors are. Posture, how you hold and move your body, that also involves that body language as well. And then that proximity, that distance between individuals. Am I doing this unit as well? So this unit, I am done. I'm going to pass it on to Courtney.
Actually, yeah, so we just heard from Emily, and now we're going to switch to Jeff Borchert, who's another behavior analyst with the co-op, and he's going to cover paraverbal and verbal communication as well as verbal intervention. Okay, I'll hand it off to Jeff.
All right, thank you. So we're going to discuss that. Paraverbal communication is the vocal part of speech, excluding the words, kind of the how of what you say, and includes 3 elements: your tone, your volume, and your cadence. And to give a little more information, that the tone is a lot of times what I refer to as the attitude of your communication. Are you being authoritative or condescending? Humorous, caring, those would be kind of some of those examples. The volume, are you talking at a volume that's appropriate to situations? Certain situations might require more volume, like if you're out on the playground during recess and need to get people's attention, versus standing right next to the student in the classroom. So again, making sure that your volume is appropriate to the situation. Your cadence is the rate of speech, as well as the pauses that you might put in your communication. So you put those 3 together, and it really can impact what a student understands from your words, and it can change the meaning for them. Okay. Verbal intervention. So this model is breaking down that defensive level and the escalation continuum that Emily talked about earlier. And the first level in this model is what we refer to as questioning. And there's 2 types of question. There's information gathering questions, which is a rational question seeking a rational response. So the student wants more information. So as a staff, we want to give a rational response, answer the questions if we can. And then there's the challenging questions, which is question your authority. In that case, we just want to downplay the challenge, stick to the topic, set limits. Okay. The next level in this continuum is refusal, and refusal is noncompliance. As a staff, we want to set limits, and we'll go into a little more detail what the setting limits looks like later. Again, with this model, Students might do these steps verbally, or they could do it also non-verbally. But non-compliance might look like them simply not responding to what you're saying or arguing with you in some way. Okay. Release. This is when the individual gets a lot more energy going. That's a verbal and emotional outburst. Okay. They might flop on the ground, kick. They may be yelling at you, calling you names, being very frustrated with what's going on. As a staff person, one of the interventions we can do is allow the venting and then remove the audience or the person from the situation. By allowing the individual to vent, they're getting rid of that emotional energy in a non-violent way. The next step we got here is intimidation. Okay. And intimidation, the individual is verbally or non-verbally threatening staff. So what that might be looking like is they might be saying, I'm going to punch you in the face. I know where your kids go to school. I know where you park your car. They might be making a fist and gesturing toward your face. They might be posturing with you. Those are all examples of intimidation. As a staff person, we want to take all threats seriously and seek assistance. And by taking all threats seriously, this student may say these things. This might not be the first time they've threatened you or intimidated you, and especially if the student is young or smaller, we might think, well, this person can't hurt me, and then your body language will follow. Again, just being really aware of what the message your body language might be portraying. So, just knowing that our environments have lots of weapons in them, so even though the person might be smaller, again, they could still hurt somebody, including themselves. And then the resolution of this one is tension reduction. It's a decrease in physical and emotional energy. Okay, it's when the person comes down. As a staff person, we want to use therapeutic rapport. But again, what this might look like is they might be apologizing. They might be asking about what consequences there might be. Some students might not even remember what they said or did, and that might be kind of scary for them. So again, that emotional energy is coming down. The breathing is returning to normal. Some students will actually even fall asleep during this time. Okay. So some of the keys to limit setting. Basically, limit setting is offering choices and consequences. So when we're setting limits, things we want to consider is that we want to make sure those limits are simple and clear. We want to make sure that the student can understand them. We want to make sure that they're reasonable. Do they make sense in the situation? Are the limits an overreaction to what's going on, or are they an underreaction? So again, we want to make sure that the limits and consequences that we set have a basis to the situation that's going on right now. And then finally, are they enforceable? Can you follow through with what you're saying? For the staff that are most effective in setting limits are the ones that do what they say they're going to do. And the student learns over time that when a student sets limits with me, that's what's going to happen. So if I make a great choice, good things are going to happen for me. If I make a poor choice, there's those consequences as well, and they know that staff will follow through. So some examples of limit setting. Okay. One of the strategies that you can use is an interrupt and redirect. So for instance, in that situation, that a student is making some sort of error, like they want to talk about their weekend and the expectation is that they are supposed to be working on their math, okay? Instead of letting them go on and continue with that, someone say, whoa, what are we supposed to be doing right now? Let's get back to math. Just a simple kind of interrupt the train of thought, get them redirected to what the expectation is. The when then, and that's just a real simple limit in regards to when you do this, then this will happen. So again, you're stating what the expected behavior is, and what will happen when they make that choice. The if then is a little more involved in regards to, if you continue this behavior, then this will happen. If you make the great choice, then this will happen. You're just kind of laying out the choices pretty black and white, both positive and negative. And again, typically you want to put the positive first to make sure that the student knows what's expected. Empathic listening. Okay, it's an active process to discern what the person is saying. Okay, so we're listening with much more than our ears. We're listening with our entire body. So it's really important for us during this empathic listening to be non-judgmental. The student might say things that you don't agree with. Okay, when we're in this mode, we're not making those judgments. We're listening for information. We're listening for the student's viewpoint to find out what's going on, so that in the end, we might be able to assist them in regards to what's going on in their life. Not necessarily there to teach at this moment, but to gather information so that we can develop that relationship with the student, but as well as look at maybe some future interventions. Give the student our undivided attention. Okay. I know this can be really hard. We're really busy. We work with a lot of kids, but I oftentimes, use that statement. 5 minutes now might save an hour later. It may also save that student from going into a really uncomfortable, stressful situation. So again, it's not just your time, but also the kind of emotions that student might experience. So again, getting on the front end and listening to what's going on can be really effective. Listening carefully, okay? Focusing on both feelings and facts. So not just, what they're saying, but also what are some of the feelings behind it? Are they frustrated? Are they sad? Are they afraid? Those are important clues for you to listen for during this time. Another thing as a staff person is allowing silence for reflection. Okay, let the student that you're working with fill in those silent voids. Oftentimes you'll get kind of that real uncomfortable but important information during those times. Let the student, as much as possible, fill that in. And as a staff person, one of the things I might do during those times is I might increase my eye contact, use my nonverbals to encourage the student to go on. Okay, restate and paraphrase. One of my favorites is that listening is full of assumptions. So it's important for us to check in with the student and kind of restate what we are understanding that they're saying to make sure that what they are saying matches up with what they mean to say. Are we hearing the message they're trying to tell, or have we taken a wrong turn along the way?
All right, now we'll move on to Rebecca, who is our autism consultant with Rum River Special Ed Cooperative, and she's going to talk about precipitating factors, rational detachment, integrated experience, and then move on to also discuss staff fear and anxiety. So I'm going to pass it off to Rebecca.
All right. Hello. So we're going to be talking about those precipitating factors, integrated experience, and the rational detachment. And we want to recognize that the underlying causes driving a person's behavior and yours helps you to respond and prevent and manage these crisis situations. When we think back to that crisis developmental model with the anxiety, defensive, risk behavior, tension reduction, and then how staff approach that and how they respond, is that integrated experience. So behavior influences behavior. And the first area that we talk about behavior influencing factors would be those precipitating factors. So factors that influence behavior, they could be internal, external. Some examples of that might be students coming in that may be hungry, they haven't received their meds, there's homelessness, parents are fighting. Other examples might be the bus ride in. So many of us that are working with students, when they come off the bus, we might see and recognize that it's been a rough morning. Those are all ways that you can then respond to those situations. And understanding why it's critical to remain consistent and calm during a crisis also gives you that ability to use that thinking brain rather than that emotional brain during these moments of crisis. So again, those precipitating factors, factors that influence behavior. And then there's some examples, and you can think of some other examples on your own, knowing the students that you work with. So moving into that rational detachment, it's that ability to manage your own behavior and the attitude. So when we talk about remaining professional, it's important that we don't take behavior personally. This is where I always like to talk about that Q-tip method. Excuse me. Quit taking it personally. Students aren't out to make us mad, but we need to really be able to rationally detach from that. And thinking back of some things that we might do to rationally detach. Some of us might be doing exercise, we might run. Some of us might binge watch Netflix. Others of us might, drink wine. It doesn't, you just really need to be able to leave work at work so that you can be professional working with situations in crisis. So that goes back to the integrated experience where our behavior influences behavior. We want to stay professional. And what does that look like? We can impact someone in crisis and they can impact us as well. Being aware of our own attitudes and perceptions and remaining in control of our own behavior will increase that likelihood of successful interventions when we're working with difficult situations and challenging behaviors in the school setting. So again, going back to using that thinking brain rather than that emotional brain. And when we talk about staff fear and anxiety, we are oftentimes, when we've talked about the crisis developmental model, we know that we are going to either fight or flight. So how do we respond to these situations? Some of us may be more experienced. We may be a little more desensitized to behavior. But how are we going to be responding? We have to understand our own fears and anxiety before we can be responding appropriately and professionally with the students and staff that we were working with. So staff fear and anxiety, we've got the unproductive, which is that freeze, overreact, and respond inappropriately. And more productively, we can increase our speed and strength. I like to think of that as kind of that Superman model, if we're going to take some superhero reminders here. Increase sensory acuity, that would be that Spider-Man. He's got that sensory acuity, trait, if you will. And then that decreased reaction time is more of that superhero of Flash. How are we going to decrease our reaction time? Slow things down so that we can be productive in responding appropriately to situations and challenging behaviors within the school setting. Maximizing our productive responses, learning to keep ourselves safe. We've talked about some proactive strategies of how to keep yourself safe. It might be the attire that you're wearing. It might be your proximity with a situation. It might be removing yourself from the situation, because sometimes we might be that precipitating factor involved in situations. Learning how to keep the individuals in crisis safe. What kind of approach are we going to do to keep all of our individuals safe and maintaining that care, welfare, safety, and security, which is our CPI model. And then using a team approach. So always having additional staff involved and using more of that team approach, which can reduce some of those unsafe situations. And then understanding what makes you afraid and drives your decisions. If you're in a situation where you need to take a break, you need to pass off with another staff. Understanding what causes you anxiety and fear with working in certain situations, and being honest and transparent with the staff that you're working with so that we can remain safe and keep everyone in situations safe at school.
Can you mute and turn
And that leads us into our decision-making model, which Courtney's going to take over here.
Hi. Okay, you have your volume off, right? Okay. So a lot of what we've been talking about leads us up to the skills that are required in order to make a decision in a crisis. If you've been successful at verbal de-escalation, you're going to make certain decisions. If it looks like the student's going to continue to escalate or engage in unsafe behavior relative to their situation, you may make other decisions. So this is the kind of objective way in which we take a look at how we are responding to a situation so that we're not over responding or under responding, because that in itself can escalate a student. Just making sure I have power. When we first talk about decision making, of course, we need to first talk about those legal and professional considerations. All of us, including behavior analysts or autism specialists or teachers, administration, we all have different professional obligations when it comes to our accreditation. How is our field regulated? Maybe we have professional codes of practice. What are the benchmarks for good practice in our field? And then, of course, relating to the larger system of criminal and civil law. So we need to consider all these things when making decisions, first and foremost. Some other key themes when we're making decisions would be our duty of care to our clients, and in this case, our students, our coworkers, other people involved in the crisis, maybe bystanders. What is in the best interest of the person in crisis or those involved in the crisis? I've already mentioned this, but being reasonable and proportionate in our response. That's a big one, and I think the decision-making matrix allows us to do that. Making sure that we're responding in the least restrictive way, and if needing to respond in a more restrictive way, such as a restrictive procedure, which this training doesn't cover, as you guys are just getting this verbal de-escalation piece, that's more of a last resort. I really like the way they talk about this. We often think about the risk of doing something and the risk of doing nothing. The common example I give is if a student is climbing on a desk, is trying to get them down, in other words, the risk of doing something greater than the risk of doing nothing? Well, it depends on many factors, such as the student's motor ability, the desk itself, is it one that tips, your ability to get them down. But there are going to be some cases where trying to get them down might be more dangerous than not, and vice versa. So weighing those things are going to be important to consider. And then also just obviously human rights and what is protecting that person's dignity and self. So here we have the decision-making matrix. When I talk about my job to other people, I talk about how I assess risk every single day, all day. And what I'm doing is I'm thinking about the chance of a bad consequence. Even as the student may just be verbally escalated, I'm kind of assessing the environment, what I know about the student, what I know about the staff, what I know about key factors in how that student is acting and where it can go and what's happening in that moment. So I'm assessing all those things all at once, all the time, and I'm thinking about risk. What is the chance of this getting bad? Now you can see how that decision can easily become very emotional. And in crisis, we don't necessarily want the person making the decisions in how to respond to come from an exclusively emotional place. That in and of itself can produce some responses that are not proportionate or are not appropriate. So we provide this decision-making matrix in order to consider more objectively the factors involved so we can respond proportionately and appropriately. The decision-making matrix works like this. On that y-axis or x-axis, sorry, we have the likelihood, the chance that an event or behavior may occur. That's the likelihood. And then we have severity, or the harm that may occur, on the y-axis there. And it's at the different intersections of these two factors that tell us a lot about risk. Just a note too, it takes a couple of times of talking about risk this way, looking at this model, in order to fully be able to embrace it and use it fluently, just like anything else we learn. So don't worry about being overwhelmed at first. This is, it feels like a lot of information the first time you encounter it. But I encourage you to practice talking about risk this way, talk about incidences this way. It'll help you become a little bit more comfortable using it in the moment and talking about your response afterwards. Here we have situations that are low risk. You can see in that lightest green area, what we have is situations that are very unlikely, but may have a high severity of harm. So, or a situation that's very likely, but has a low severity of harm. And we think about transportation as kind of our good example of this. So if we know that, like if we think about traveling by plane versus other modes of transportation, it's relative to other types of transportation. Flying in a plane, it's very unlikely that something bad is going to happen. But if it does, it's going to be really bad. But that doesn't mean that our risk is super high with it. We would want these two components to intersect more directly to say that risk is higher. So what we're seeing is the likelihood of an event or behavior, if that is very likely to happen, but it has a low severity of harm. So we know it's going to happen, but even if it does, it's not going to be so bad. That is going to be another low risk event. If we move into the medium level and high, medium just kind of falls in between these two. Obviously, it might be moderately likely or moderately severe. So you kind of are assessing that medium level. If it's high, it's something that's very likely to happen, and it has a high severity of harm if it does. So another transportation example here would be if you were riding perhaps a motorcycle, just compared to other forms of transportation, the likeliness of an accident happening is high. And then if it does, it's really bad. It has a high severity of harm. Just going back 1 second, the other transportation example I didn't give was that second option under lower risk. So cars, very likely to end up in car accidents compared to other modes of transportation. But when they do, it's a low severity of harm. Now, we all know somebody that maybe has been in a severe car accident, but just looking at the big picture across they're mostly fender benders that have a low severity of harm. So again, driving may be a low risk, depending. I used to train with somebody who also talked about the level of skill and training a person has. So if her husband is a motorcyclist and he had a high level of skill and training in riding a motorcycle, and so maybe his risk is lower because of those factors. Another factor we consider with decision making is that team intervention. So let me go back here. When we're operating as a team, we're doing so because of safety, professionalism, and litigation. When you're working with an escalated student, you really should have another person with you if possible, because if that student lashes out at you or is increasingly escalated, then it would be nice to have another person there to assist. Particularly in your guys' positions who are receiving this training, you may not be trained in restricted procedure use, for example. And so you in particular will want to turn that over to somebody if it looks like it's going to continue to escalate or become more dangerous. Professionalism, it's nice to have that other person there to record and help you maintain the expectations of the situation, so they can make sure that you're calm. You know, we're all in a situation where at times particular situations can get under our skin, and it's nice to have the other person to say like, hey, do you want to trade out? Okay. And then also for litigation, it's nice to have another person witness the event so that they can attest to the steps and measures that were taken. We talk about the team leader. A lot of times this is just the first person that's on the scene. That person may continue to be the leader in the crisis if they're competent and if they're confident, if they've had that training and they feel good about using it. It may also just be the person who has the best rapport. So it could be that I've had situations where we have a student in crisis. I'm the first person on the scene, but I don't actually know that student very well. I'm confident and competent, but I don't maybe have the best rapport because I don't really know the student. And so my first question may be to the other staff around, who has good rapport with the student? Who is the person that works most with them? And if they are trained, confident, competent, I may ask them to take over as that team leader. And don't be afraid to do that. You don't have to stay the team leader just because you're the first one there. As auxiliary team members, you're going to do a lot of things. You're going to make sure that the status of the individual physically and psychologically is okay. So you're going to be kind of observing them. You're going to make sure that the environment is safe. You may need to move objects out of the way in order to maintain that safety. And then you're going to also look for situations that maybe additional assistance is needed, whether you can provide that or you need to bring somebody else in that can. And maybe a need to change intervention strategies. I've been in a situation where we've been in a crisis and I say, I think let's just try to back away. Let's see if that is a good strategy here. You may also engage in that verbal de-escalation with the student if you're directed to do so by the team leader, and just generally supporting the other team members, kind of seeing what it is that they need. The team leader, what their job is to really do a lot of the planning, making sure that the overall crisis is being followed with some sort of plan as to what's next or how are you going to proceed. They're going to make a lot of the decisions. So they may say, we're going to move over here. We're going to do this next, or I need you to get me, some more documentation. And they're also going to do a lot of that communicating unless otherwise directed. There are times where I'm leading a crisis and I may actually want to assign the communication with the student to another person. Just as I'm trying to process risk and managing other aspects, I may even pass that one off. Safety, I'm just overall monitoring the safety of everybody in the situation and acting accordingly. And then I'm also going to lead those post-vention approaches, so that debrief that's going to happen, and make sure that we process that incident in a logical way so that we can learn from it, improve for next time if needed, and have the required documentation. So that concludes the verbal de-escalation piece. There are a few reflection questions I just want to put out there for you guys as we go. So I'm just going to show those here at the end. So when we think about the 4 words that describe the underpinning values of nonviolent crisis intervention training, and how do these relate to the work that you do? So those 4 words are care, welfare, safety, and security. And I want you guys to continue to think about how they relate to your everyday work. and what you're doing with students. The other thing that we learned about was that crisis development model. So you want to become pretty fluent in understanding these so that in the moment you can identify the level of the student if they are being defensive or questioning. And continue to think about and talk amongst your team about how that level appears in your work. What does that look like for this student? What does it look like for another student? And then it's a great exercise to describe what response you would have to intervene with that individual displaying that particular level of behavior. So it's not just a model that we can look at, it's one that we can use. It's one I use frequently. I'm trying to identify a lot of times where the student's at so I can respond proportionately. You can understand how if a student is in that refusal model and you're you think they're in therapeutic rapport because you haven't identified it correctly, then there may be some escalation there. This question is, what are 2 examples of behavior you may see if someone is at the second level of crisis development? And what might be one thing you do if you see those behaviors? So remember, our first level was questioning. Our next level was refusal. So if they're refusing, you may see a student just sitting and doing nothing. You may see them more outwardly, verbally refusing. And then another thing to consider with your team would be what might influence an individual demonstrating a level of crisis behavior? What might influence a staff in their approach? And it goes back to identifying what you're seeing and responding in accordance with that integrated experience. Again, under responding or over responding with your staff attitude or approach may affect and worsen that crisis development or behavior level we're seeing with our student. We also learned about that nonverbal or paraverbal communication. So maybe something you do among yourselves is to think about how you would use one of those concepts to manage your own behavior in responding to an individual in any level of crisis. We all have different quirks in those areas, so it's good to have that self-knowledge. Okay, that is the end of our verbal de-escalation training. If you have questions, please feel free to follow up with your district CPI trainer or your coordinator, and we'll be happy to get back to you. Our contact information is also on the Rum River Special Education website. And additionally, when possible, either on the website or given to you by a coordinator or trainer, I have a handout that accompanies this training, so you may have access to that. Okay, well, thank you, and happy de-escalating.